Hello. Oh, you're making way for your backdrop.
Yeah, the very sad news. No more national service children.
Well, anyway, hello everybody. Welcome to the Blind Spot Blindside experimental podcast, which we have pivoted from the original of Junseth, who we still praise every time we start on account of having we need to make reparations for having stolen his real estate a little bit. But anyway, as usual, we run through the Blind Spot newsletter from last week and look forward to what we are writing about this weekend. However, it's July 5th. There's been a massive election in the UK. It would be rude not to mention it first. So, as predicted, Labour has got a landslide, which means the entire regime in the UK is changing. I forgot to say, I'm Izabella Kaminska, for those listening on the podcast. Our small, select audience that is growing every week slightly, but not, we have to acknowledge them, Dario. And I am, as usual, joined by Dario. Dario, introduce yourself properly, because maybe actually before we talk about Labour, Dario, just give our listeners and readers a bit more context on who you are and how you ended up at Blind Spot, because I just realized we never did that.
No, that's true. So, hi everyone. I'm Dario. Izzy and I met each other a little while after we started communicating because Izzy wrote a really incredible article about the impact of UFOs on ETFs and space ETFs. And I was at Crawl at the time, and I was trying to this really youthful attempt to trying to convince an international, corporation to vouch for my UFO business development proposal. And so I reached out to Izabella.
As you do, Dario.
Yeah. So I reached out to Izzy with the hopes that I could get some officialized backing for this. And I remember I emailed you at like 12:30 at night, and I was like, who am I emailing an editor at FT Alphaville at this time? And then you answered me 5 minutes later, and I said, okay, she's crazy too.
Oh, thanks, Dario. Nice. I was I often do the best reading, and it's in that calm period in the middle of the night when my daughter is asleep already. That's why I answer at 12:30. But yes, Dario and I needed a safe pair of hands to help me on the Blind Spot, and so Dario very kindly decided to join me, and he had great research experience from his time at Kroll. But the other point, the reason I wanted you to introduce yourself, was to stress your historical credentials, because you're effectively a historian, right?
Well, we both are, right? Mm-hmm. Same alma mater as well. But yes, history has always been my passion, as it has been yours, which is why there are such an incredible amount of references to the Roman Empire on the Blind Spot.
For those who did, by the way, and for those who didn't read the piece that Dario was referring to, it was a kind of hypothetical what is going on, because it was like in the context of that, I think it was in 2021 maybe, when there was continuing, like there seemed to be a lot of there was growing discussion about UFOs within what I would say the serious realm, which I found very interesting and indicative of three possibilities. Either that's true, either they're lying, or some sort of third notable, which is nobody really knows, right? But it's useful for all sorts of other purposes. So it is... I found it quite interesting from a game theory perspective. That was the point of the piece. Anyway, do check it out if you want, somewhere on Alphaville still. But in the meantime, UK elections, Labour landslide. How, I think for those listeners who are not based in the UK, just to update. So the Tories have been terribly unpopular. I should stress, we're non-partisan here. We're incredibly, we are looking at everything very objectively. We don't have a position, but we also don't want to, our mission at the Blind Spot is to look at the trends that are not necessarily being talked about in the mainstream, and to look beyond the sort of headline situation. And I think the context is the Tories have been terribly unpopular. and they've been booted out. On the surface of it, it looks like Labour has had this landslide election for them. They've won with, I think at the moment the latest is 412 seats. The Tories have got 121. The Liberal Democrats have really done very well with 71. And the story really isn't that, in my opinion, it's not that Labour has done so well. It's more that the Tories have completely thrown this. However, they have done better than the last poll on Wednesday was predicting. So they haven't done as badly as they were predicted. The polls generally were incredibly variable. So that in itself was interesting. So it sounded like, apart from the obvious certainty that Labour was going to win a lot, in terms of the opposition, the makeup of the opposition, there was quite a big question mark about how badly the Tories would do. And the other unexpected but kind of expected part of it is that the Greens and Reform have done really well, and some of the independents. So Corbyn has done quite well. He's won his seat as an independent in Islington. And the Greens have picked up more than I expected they would. And the Greens have become kind of like the Corbyn party de facto, because the left wing that is very unhappy with the far left, I would call, that is unhappy with the sort of center Labour Party being very pro-Israel, has kind of backed Green. And so the Greens are very much the kind of old Corbynists now, and their manifesto was very, very lefty. And then on the other side, Farage has come in with so far 4 seats. There's, I think, 2 seats left to declare. I'm not sure which ones. I suspect 4 is what Reform is going to get. And that has also been very surprising. But the real story is about the vote share. The UK has a first past the post voting system, which means that it's not the power in Parliament doesn't necessarily reflect the proportional share of any particular party's popularity. And on that front, Labour have actually not done that well at all. They've come in under 34%, just under 34%, which is one of the worst, if not the worst, in modern time, ways to win an election. And certainly much lower than Boris. Boris got 43% when he won a landslide with fewer seats, mind you. And the really interesting thing is that even though the Lib Dems have done really well with 71 seats, their vote share is lower than Reform's. So Reform has done, last I saw it was like 14 or 15% relative to the Lib Dems, which I haven't got the figures to hand, but it was Lib Dems were lower. So that in itself is very interesting. And it's reflective of this Fraser
Lib
Nelson.
Dems at 12, Reform at 14.
Yeah, so it's reflective of what Fraser Nelson and people on the right are saying is more of a Potemkin landslide. It just has the appearance of a landslide, but in terms of popular sentiment, it's not quite as wonderful as everyone is saying. Some people mainly held their nose and voted tactically to get rid of the Tories, to send them a message. And it's a terrible night in terms of personalities for, being booted out. Penny Mordaunt has gone, and who else is a notable person who's gone? Grant Shapps. Rishi Rees-Mogg has gone, but Rishi has actually unexpectedly, he was expected to lose his seat, but he has held on. And so has Jeremy Hunt. But some of these like wins have been very close, very close. The last one I saw had like 18 seats in it, so it's incredibly close. The other notable person to have lost their seat is Liz Truss, and she definitely lost out because Reform split her vote, giving power to the Labour candidate in her constituency. So that's about it. But what's the story behind the story is what we want to know. And what's your view from afar in Spain, Dario?
So the first thing that sticks out in Spain is that we've also been having quite low or relatively low voter turnouts for the last few election cycles here, and because of the makeup of modern day politics, we've had a very similar, big center left party, small hard left party, big center right party and a far right party that is eating into the right wing party. So we have a very similar political scenario in Spain, but because we don't have a first past the post system, we don't have proportional representation like in Germany, but we have a type of first past the post system that's more proportional. It means that the socialists in government have been in a minoritarian government, even though under the UK FPTP they would have gained absolute majority, which means that they've been in bed with separatists for the past 4 or 5 years and passing laws that many people in Spain call out as treasonous. And even though we don't want to get into hyperbole, getting into bed with people who want to secede from your country in order to keep your government running is naturally something that's bad for the government. And so what that calls to mind is this is an interesting debate on whether first past the post is good because it guarantees governability at the expense of democratic representation. But one way or the other, it means that the UK will be guaranteed a strong government, unlike what's happening in Spain.
But I think, so I've put this as my backdrop, because what I think is interesting about the proportional side of it, like even when it comes to seats, this is obviously seats one, but there is this concentration issue where like cities versus regions, and as a result, the makeup of the spread around the UK in terms of who has power where on a regional basis, I just think it's really interesting. It's very technicolor. It's a very technicolor,
yes.
Distribution, which is very different to last time when it was very blue, and that's a function of urbanization and concentrated areas. But I think it is quite interesting.
Yes, that's very good.
You have no idea the UK Conservatives were unpopular in the US. Yeah, exactly. So,
but what I wanted to ask you, Izzy, is that what's your thought on the consequences that this Labour victory is going to have, especially economically?
So that's what I wanted to talk about. Obviously, last week we focused a lot about last week's newsletter was pushing forward my idea about reform, not reform the party, but just this idea that the Western economies are in a very kind of precarious state and at an inflection point. Everybody knows reform is needed of the economy, but there's disagreement on how that should happen. And I think a lot of this is where the blind spots are, because there have been big trends happening, and we in the press and even in academia, we've been very focused on specific little niches, and we've lost the big picture. And the big picture is that there's been this kind of fight on the political level between how best to reform the Western state. And I think some key things can be assumed, which are, by and large, absolutely everybody agrees that globalization has run its course, that we cannot continue the globalization experiment, and that this is down to China not playing fair, and that China was supposed to become more like us, but it didn't, and then it never liberalized and never opened its economy. As a result, almost everyone agrees that like tariffs and protectionism is the order of the day. And I think this is where in the US it's kind of misrepresented sometimes, because Trump has always been presented as this anti-China high tariff person, but Biden never unwound any of those positions, and I think actually Bidenomics was as dependent on protectionism as anything Trump was doing. And then in Europe, it's very similar in that almost everyone is protectionist against China. There's a few holdouts maybe, but by and large, there is an anti-China. We need to protect our Western economies. And the real discussion is about in what shape we can reform the West and make it more competitive. And you'll hear everywhere now this like conversation about competitiveness, which for me is a bit euphemistic, because competitiveness, it's not how we understand competition in terms of a free market and allowing more more commerce and antitrust and getting internal competition. Competitiveness is really about how the G7 bloc, competes with China and how it competes with Russia and its sort of non-like-minded foes in the world, in the global economy. So there's a massive dispute whether the best path forward is having more of a open economy domestically, focused on tax cuts, deregulation, and allowing us to generate growth and outperform China through further openness. And that's both in Europe, Britain, and in America. And the sort of planners, as I call them, who want to revive this post-war era where there was more Keynesian, New Deal type economic thinking, industrial policy, where government has a direct sort of say on how capital is allocated. Overall, everyone is agreed that we've run out of credit. There's only so much. So it's either austerity or there is unfunded spending, which is directed in a way that can galvanize industry. But the question is, in what way? And so Rachel Reeves is now going to be the new Chancellor of the UK. And this is where I think the blind spot is that she is part of this new consensus, which comes alongside Biden and Janet Yellen. And I think a similar thing is happening in Europe with Draghi. And they're calling it something called modern supply side economics, which sounds very Thatcherite because obviously Thatcher is all about supply side, but it's actually the anti-Thatcher in the sense that it focuses on the inflation problem. Like everyone agrees we need more supply. That is the fundamental issue. And we've not been focused on that for many years because of globalization and China being the factory of the world. So we need to reshore and invest in our own systems, but it's about whether we do it through market liberalization or whether we do it through planning. And modern supply side economics is basically saying we do it the planning way. And that means, if you read Rachel Reeves's speeches, which I did yesterday, I hadn't appreciated how anti-globalization she was. I hadn't appreciated the degree to which she was going to put industrial policy first. She's a former Bank of England woman, economist rather. She's obviously a woman. She comes from banking. She's sort of pitched as this safe pair of hands that's going to be able to, please markets by not doing anything too radical. But I think the bigger picture being lost is that there's this consensus around modern supply side economics, which basically means, I'd be interested if anyone watching disagrees, but in my book, it means us becoming more like China. And there is some logic to it. I don't want to say there isn't. I think it's definitely clear we need more industrial policy. We do need to rebuild our, core infrastructure and all of that. But the question is, can we do it in the current social context? Like what it worked in World War II after World War II, I would say, until it didn't. So by the 70s, that policy had completely started to backfire because it had not managed to allocate resources where needed, which is why by the 1970s we had to break away from the gold standard, and you ended up with a pathway to Thatcherism and mass liberalization, right? So that is what happened, and that's when globalization kind of became a thing, and markets, the sort of financialization of politics began. But now we're doing the opposite, so it's like a mirror of what we did back then. We're kind of doubling down on industrial policy and going, yes, well, we can make it happen because it worked after World War II. But I say it's very different. We're not the same society. These sorts of grand industrial policy planning mechanisms, I think, work best when you are a very cohesive society that has a very compelling and well, not compelling, but like, I guess a strong vision of who they are, and has a mentality that is prepared to make sacrifices, which is not the current generation. I mean, you're representative of that generation. I think the idea of having to make sacrifices, like, you know, less free travel abroad, less capital, you know, this is possibly the beginning of capital controls, and, you know, more, we will have freedom within our own bloc, but not so much beyond the bloc. So I see it as a kind of European G7 Western Comic-Con being the economic partnership of the former Soviet Union. I see it kind of emerging a bit like that, and it's very possible that all the like-minded G7 states who go in line with modern supply side economics will sort of help each other out. That means different countries and different blocs will have different competitive advantages within their own blocs. But yeah, that's my reading. What do you think?
I mean, it's obviously, if you if you listen to that logic really practically and what the consequences are, it's obviously quite scary. Because I would not like to be limited in my ability to travel, and neither would anyone else, naturally.
I mean, you'll be able to travel within the block,
by rail, to not hurt the planet, right? Because that's how it's going to be sold. But yeah, so I find it. I mean, I find it hellish. But what keeps on coming to my mind is, how do they think they're going to get away with it this time? Is it really just it's going to work because of AI?
Yes, so I think that's a big element of it. A big element of it is that we now have AI, and so AI, we can put our trust in AI, and the technocrats can take over. So a lot of this will be done through the technocracy, and, you know, as long as X, you know, we put X in, Y comes out, that is, you know, and we can trust the black box that is AI to configure the regulation and the incentives that, like, so politicians will do whatever the technocrats tell them to do. And that's what's also very interesting about Rachel Reeves being a former Bank of England woman, is that, you know, Mark Carney also has endorsed her highly. And I think it's interesting that she is coming into number 11 or number 10. I can't remember which one they live in now. They swapped at some point, but she's going to be Chancellor. And it's a reverse revolving door, because usually it is the Treasury people that go to the Bank of England. So now the Bank of England is in, like, theoretically, you know, who knows what her loyalties are, but, like, you could make an argument that the Bank of England has their person now in number 11. So if you're going to get, like, Truss paranoid, as in Liz Truss, and say the Bank of England staged a coup against her, and it's now come to replace her with someone from the Bank of England in the Treasury, going for growth, you know. And this is also quite interesting, because Rachel Reeves has done a lot of speeches where she's been compared to Margaret Thatcher, because she does invoke a lot of the same rhetoric, and she's pushing for this go for growth thing, which is very similar to what Liz Truss was. Again, the only difference isn't it's the flavor of how she's going to go for growth. And the flavor is more, as she calls it in her speech, active government, active state involvement in the economy. She talks about creating a partnership between the free market and the business free market between, sorry, excuse me, I'm a bit tired from watching the election. A partnership between the free market and the state in terms of how they operate. I mean, I'm not going to say it's very, you know, there's another famous equivalent of that from modern history where there was a partnership between the state and the business community for a social, higher social cause. You know, I'm sure you know which one I'm talking about.
Yeah. And
it's Italian.
Yeah, the Spanish, huh?
Oh yeah, yes, of course. Yeah. Actually, do you know what? I don't know enough about Franco. Like, tell me about how, I mean, yeah, what was the Franco, like, what was the social contract between Franco and the business community?
So the initial social contract was we're not going to expropriate you, we're going to protect you from the Republic's most extreme partisans. But it's very crucial to understand that at the beginning of the Civil War, the urban class was not in favor of Franco, because Franco, at the end of the day, being an autarchist and a protectionist, just as the Republic was opening up for trade and bringing a lot of wealth to the elite of Spain, it means that the Spanish industrial elite was quite split between Franco and the Republic, or at least, sorry, the Falangist or rebellion against the Republic, because Franco only came in around 1937-38. But going forwards, what really defined his reign was a serious alliance with industry, where he essentially protecting them from competition, from foreign competition. But very importantly, he also got social security. He got a lot of rights for their workers. It was a very fascist-y type movement of empowering workers and giving them a voice inside state-sanctioned unions, which is, of course, the main difference between Marxism and fascism in this sense, in the practical sense.
That's really interesting. I mean, so one of the things we've been writing about at my other hat at Politico is how in the months leading up to Labour's, the regime change, let's say, business community has got really on side with Labour, and she's been sort of meeting and having these meetups with business community for months now. And one way of thinking of it is that the business community was aware that the Tories are going to be out, and they have to scramble. They want to get the best deal they can, so it pays to suck up to the new administration as early as possible, right? And secure, if there's going to be this credit rationing environment where not everyone's going to end up on the priority list or the national interest list, then they have to make a case, like in some sort of courtier style, as to why they should be favored by the Reeves administration, and why they should be given credit and others shouldn't, right? So that has been a hallmark of the last 6 months, I would say. And they have reached a sort of concord, and the business community was given enough reassurances to back them and to give them money to, they've been reassured that, Labour won't come too much for their corporate profits. I guess they might take a bit, but not so much. And hence the sort of ambiguity about tax hikes. That, I think, is part of that social contract they've made with the corporations. Like, we won't tax you too much yet, although everyone does think she's lying. Like, then inevitably, to fund her great vision, she's going to have to do some radical things. And among the radical things is they're starting something called GB Energy. That's one of their intentions, but they also want to create a national wealth fund. And that, it was really very interesting, because what is a national wealth fund for a country that doesn't have any natural surpluses at the moment? It doesn't. I mean, it makes sense if you're Saudi Arabia to have a wealth fund, or if you're Norway, but if you're the UK, what does that actually mean? And that means, in my eyes, it means repression of financial repression that then is directed into a national interest investment scheme. And that is that is much more like what China did in the early days than it is reflective of what Saudi Arabia, or a resource-rich country, would do. And so that means, I would say, strategics of devaluation of sterling in relative terms to make it more competitive, but also to make it our exports incredibly, far more sellable on the international market within our bloc, right? So I think that is the intention there, is very much like what the Chinese did, which is to repress the consumer, force the consumer to save into the National Wealth Fund, and the National Wealth Fund will then direct those savings, like SAFE did, or whoever. Like, obviously, in the case of China, they bought a lot of foreign treasury debt. In the case of the UK, they're going to be using it to invest in domestic infrastructure and to push ahead. And I can see why that is appealing. I can see why that makes sense for a lot of people. And, you know, it could work. I'm not saying it doesn't. Like,
one of the things that comes to mind in all of this is exactly along the lines of what you're saying, which is what's the deal in it for business, and how does, how will this partnership look? And one of the things that has been on my mind recently has been the huge amount of free trade zones that are being authorized in Britain, which is almost one of the only remaining ideas of Brexit Britain, right? The free trade zones. And just, I'm reading this really great book called Shogun by Philip Lavelle, if that was his name. And it reminds me of the fact that in any Spanish newspaper, whenever it's a story about the English, all the comments are calling the English pirates. And that's because one of the things that allowed the British state to renew itself was the permission of granting, these legal titles to pirates and privateers, that they could essentially do what they wanted and have their own little piece of free trade, as long as they then gave a share to the crown. And even if that meant, plundering and setting, villages and innocents to the sword. So I think the question of free trade zones is going to be one to watch. It's going to be interesting to see what kind of autonomy businesses have there, and how that shapes up into their new agreement with the British state, especially under this financial repression, right?
Well, yes, that is. I mean, that was a Tory initiative, so it'll be interesting to see what happens under Reeves. I haven't looked into how she, what her view on that is, so I don't know. I don't want to speak. I don't want to make assumptions, because it's unclear to me whether she would be supportive or not of that. Based on my reading of her policy so far, I think, every single state, even China, recognizes the need for some sort of free trade zone. Like China obviously now has Hong Kong. And I think even before that, you had certain freedoms allowed in places like Macau that weren't available onshore. So there is a sort of understanding that there needs to be a free trade zone. How free it will be is the question. Like, will it just be for trade within the Western Bloc, or will it be for trade beyond the Western Bloc?
I'm just excited for corporate fiefs in British mainland.
Yeah, I mean, I think if your business is not in one of the national interest areas, you will end up having to abscond to Dubai or somewhere like that. But anyway, let's move on very quickly. We don't want to make this too long. You were looking at the US, because I think that's also very interesting. Like this past week, we've had a big central banking conference in Sintra, Portugal. And the notable thing was, the markets were remarkably stable. I was very fearful about France, right? I was very fearful the centrists would be, actually, let's do it like this. I was very fearful that the French on Monday would boot out the centrists and that the markets wouldn't take it very well. But that didn't happen. What has happened is that the centrists had enough of a showing to then create a sort of tactical alliance with the left. So by the time that they put in their candidate seats on Tuesday night, it looked like, markets are still quite all right. They see it as a sort of, there is still a scenario where you get what the equivalent of a French hung parliament is. And that means an equilibrium, which isn't great, but it's not terrible. And the sort of the competing forces would mean that you would probably not see too much craziness go on, and Macron's overall agenda wouldn't get crushed. But at the same time, you have Macron drifting to the left, and he now has more of an excuse to push ahead with more lefty spending plans. And so I think the last thing I heard was that originally you had Bruno Le Maire worrying that if people vote left, it would be like IMF intervention and tragedy for France. Now the message seems to be that actually a centrist lefty alliance is going to be better for France than any majority situation for Le Pen, because that the alternative would be a fragmentation of the EU, which is the worst case scenario for the market, right? So that's how they see it. So it's okay to do crazy spending plans, but only as a bloc, as long as you maintain cohesiveness and commitment to the French sort of France as part of the EU and within the construct of more planning rather than less. To be fair, I think I'm not really sure what Le Pen's spending. I think she's not. I think she's quite an industrial policy person as well. So I'm not sure there is even a free market.
Well.
Sorry?
Big on agricultural protection as well.
Exactly.
Very
so I don't think there isn't. I don't think in France it's quite Trussy like. I don't think there is like this radical, and that's in the tradition of France, like which has always been quite dirigist, and you've had Mitterrand in the past. So this isn't. France is somewhat different to the UK, but the key point is that in Sintra, whereas the expectation was that people be worried about France having a debt crisis, really Ben Munston, my colleague at Politico, wrote a lovely report out of there noting that the bigger concern was about America, and that is to do with fears of Trump coming into power now that Biden has crashed due to his obvious senility, and this is what markets are much more worried about on the Biden issue. So now you've been looking into presidential immunity, right?
Yeah. So I don't want to tread on toes because I know we have some American viewers, but the first thing I thought of when we heard this, the Supreme Court's decision on presidential immunity, which goes well beyond Trump, and the very basic summary is that Trump has full immunity from all actions taken under his official role as president, because the highest legal document is a constitution and he is the president, and so everything official must be under immunity, whereas things that he may have done in private are under presumptive immunity because these acts may have had an official aspect. And so the real point the Supreme Court justices were trying to make is that you cannot impinge on any aspect of presidential power through criminal liability, because that would damage the Constitution's point in having a strong executive. That was a whole bit with Alexander Hamilton's pieces or one of the pieces, I forgot which, in the Federalist, about how you need a strong executive in order to have a strong government. So that is essentially what the justices were trying to say. This is at least my reading on the decision, which is that it is part of a very long history that has been happening since at least the 1930s, which was started actually by Democrats. And this idea of the unitary executive theory, that the executive in the United States is supreme in its power. The president in the United States is supreme over the executive, rather than having Congress do big checks on its power. But another thing that I'll be going into, which is this in this week's newsletter, is a very interesting point that what's actually happened is not an increase in power to the presidency, because in effect, we already knew that the president was immune for official acts, and we already knew that in a way he had presumptive immunity, because that's also something that Nixon was debating in Watergate. If the president does it, it's legal. So this question has been going on for a very long time. The critical element is that the Supreme Court has said that itself and federal courts, so itself ultimately, has the right to decide or to judge when the act is either official or private. So when he can be criminally or civilly liable, and when he is covered by presidential immunity. So what this really means is an increase in the judicialization of the American state and in the checks of the executive coming now from the judiciary branch rather than the congressional branch. But we'll go more into that in the newsletter.
So our friend of the blind spot, Tim Ferguson, who is a lawyer, and obviously
knows a lot more about this than I do,
and also incredibly, I mean, Tim and I share an interest in anacyclosis, which I'm sure you've noticed if you've been reading on Alphaville, his series on the whole idea of anacyclosis, which is this concept that the founding fathers also appreciated because it allowed for them to structure the US political system around the anticipation of anacyclosis happening, which is this revolution of political office, in that it always moves from a sort of executive strongman singular king type structure that gets corrupted. It then gets taken over by an oligarchy or a soft oligarchy, a good oligarch, it can be good or bad, but if it's usually good, then it gets corrupted, and then that prompts a revolution, and then the revolution resorts to mob rule, and it creates the conditions for a strong man to emerge again. And so the founding fathers wanted to structure a system around that anticipation of those forces playing out, and that's why you have these three different parts of the political system. I'm not an expert on US politics, just to be clear, but my understanding is that the revolution is sort of baked into the system on purpose. So you have controlled revolution instead of uncontrolled revolution. So Tim's an expert on that stuff, and I asked him a while ago about the immunity thing, and he was a little bit hesitant he didn't want to back the idea of complete immunity being within the Constitution. He had a really clever, I've forgotten like the details of it, but just looking at my WhatsApp when I was speaking to him, sympathetic. He's not sympathetic to the argument that anything less than total immunity can have a chilling effect on the exercise of executive authority. So there is essentially a limitation on immunity in his mind. Like, so it isn't total in his reading of the Constitution. But it'll be interesting to see how that maps out with your you're going to speak to him, I hope, because
Yes.
although it was July 4th yesterday, so no surprises that he was busy. But on Biden more specifically, I think the big concern is just like, who is running the country, because obviously he's not. And I think personally that's been quite obvious for a long time, and I'm shocked that it took this long for people to acknowledge this. And I've been in fights many times with people on the internet and in reality, in real life, sort of arguing that it's clearly the case that he's not in control. It reminds me very much of how Pope John Paul II, by the time, actually comparable to most of the popes who die, kind of senile, and they're not in control. And this allows for the sort of church deep state to rise up, and you don't really know who is in charge, right? So it's kind of similar. So who is in charge? That's the question. I mean, is it Jill? Is it sort of Obama? Is it the Pentagon? Is it, where is people often say it's okay because he's got very strong people around him, and that is all well and good, and I'm glad that he has strong people around him. However, that is not in keeping with the democratic concept of being able to hold your executive to account. Like, if the people in control are actually sort of murky, power players and advisors, where does the accountability lie? There isn't one, because you're actually the American system is in the hands of some sort of technocracy, right?
And the interesting bit is that in almost every previous administration, there was this other guy or this other woman, or this team of people that we could recognize as being in charge and influential, like Henry Kissinger or Condoleezza Rice or whatever. But in Biden's administration, who is that?
Yeah.
Again, maybe this is down to my ignorance of how things are going, but I don't think I'm wrong in saying that it's interesting that the surrounding team of Biden, if Biden has been, as he's clearly had a stroke, the poor man, and is being drugged through this. I'm actually kind of sad for him. Maybe the message is we can't outshine him because he's so clearly outshineable. And so that's why they're not getting any publicity. I don't know. I just find it weird that in this scenario, we actually don't know that much about who has the power in his surroundings. Because at least I don't. It's not like Kamala does either, because Kamala definitely doesn't. She's as big of a leader as somebody knows she's Latino.
If he's replaced by who could replace him? I mean, if it is Gavin Newsom, I mean, that would be awful, because you're basically bypassing Kamala. That would be a terrible signal to send, right?
It'd be. I mean, you can't run him. Kamala. She's incredibly unpopular and just has this incredibly terrible laugh.
But you also can't bypass her because of. I mean, I'm going to be blunt, but you can't bypass a woman, a black woman who is the vice president, and appoint anyone who is not in the current sort of
identity. This is America.
No, but in the current identity politics conscious world, to bypass her with anyone of different sort of identity qualities would send a terrible signal for your own message.
The only reason why Kamala's in that position is because she's a minority woman. Because she doesn't really have any popularity or any backing, even inside the Democratic Party. She was 8th when she was elected as VP.
That would just make that explicit, and would backfire on them. And this is why that's why Michelle Obama is the obvious contender, and that is why Michelle Obama is the only person who can really substitute, or Susan Rice, maybe someone like that. Those are the only. But I don't see Susan Rice going for it. Maybe, I don't know. I mean,
I don't see Michelle Obama going for it either. This last minute like this,
I don't know. But those are the contenders, in my opinion, for the pure sort of optics of not displacing Kamala. Do you see what I mean? I mean,
it's
terribly brutal, but I think that is the reality we face. Anyways, we have to wrap up soon. But you have you're going to do Syria update as well, right?
Yes. So a very short Syria update, because it's still too early to know what's going on. But essentially, 5 days ago, Erdogan said that he was going to do a peace deal with Bashar al-Assad, and indicated that they were going to have a meeting, which they are currently having. And coincidentally, not so coincidentally, allegedly because there was a Syrian refugee that was arrested in Turkey for taking advantage and I think murdering a little boy, a Turkish boy, that started anti-Syrian refugee riots across southern Turkey. And the repression against these riots then caused the Syrian militants in northern Syria that are backed by the Turkish army to turn against the Turkish army, lower several Turkish flags, ambush several Turkish vehicles, and several trucks run by Turkish civilians. So the crisis seems to have abated for now. But there was also, interestingly enough, an advance by the Syrian rebels against the Syrian National Army, against the Syrian Arab Army, which is run by Bashar al-Assad. Even though that kind of stopped, it's interesting to note that there seems to be a revival in terms of the beginning of the end musical tones in the Syrian conflict, as well as Kurdish websites talking about Turkey deploying ISIS mercenaries to fight them in Iraq. But then the Kurdish regions of Iraq are always some maelstrom of different people, which we never know, because there was a drone strike in Erbil as well by the United States against the suspected terrorists. So, but the thing with Erbil and Kurdish Iraq is that it is really deep state territory, because nobody cares what's going on. There's a lot of oil wealth. There's a lot of things going on there under the scenes. Turkey's operating there. The United States is operating there. Most of NATO countries are still operating there. So is Israel. So is Iran. So there's a lot going on in Kurdish Iraq, and I'm afraid I can't speak to that. But it is interesting that Turkey may end up doing a deal with Assad. And we'll see. We should see by the end of this weekend if those musical tunes are true.
Well, on that note, we've got to wrap up. Do check out the newsletter. And apologies if I've been a bit disjointed in my articulation today, but I that's what happens to me when I don't get enough sleep. And this is why I could never be Prime Minister, because the sound bites would be awful. I would be worse than Kamala Harris. You could take any part of this podcast and make me sound like a total idiot, because I do word substitution and all sorts. So apologies for that. This is just the way my brain works. But I hope you enjoyed it anyway, and we'll see you next week. Thanks very much, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.
Oh, and thank you to the 4 people who've been watching. very, very kind.
And did you see this?
Okay, he's gone.